I'm Chelsea.
And I'm Bianca.
And welcome back to the Preservice PODSQUAD podcast.
So everyone get excited because this week we are joined by the New Jersey State Teacher of the Year for 2024, Mr. Joe Nappi. Did you guys say hi?
Hey, thank you so much for having me on the show. I appreciate it.
Of course. We're so happy that you were here, and we're hopeful that our listeners are excited to hear from you today too. But for anyone who's unfamiliar with Joe, he's currently a social studies teacher at Monmouth Regional High School, and we're going to talk a little bit about his experiences in teaching today and your journey to becoming an educator, and just hear what advice you have for us as pre-service educators. So.
Absolutely. I'm excited to be here, excited to tell my story. So.
Perfect.
Great.
So just to kind of start it off, we want to get to know a little bit more about you and your background. So if you could just tell us how you became an educator, and was there a specific experience or person that guided you into the profession?
Sure. So my journey into education is an unlikely one, to say the least, in that I greatly dislike school, at least from 7th grade on. Prior to 7th grade, I was like an honor student, top of my class, all that sort of stuff. My mom bought me an Oxford t-shirt. She had high dreams of me going across the pond and, studying over there. I'm hoping on a full scholarship. But puberty hit me hard in a lot of ways. One of which was, I know now that I had undiagnosed ADHD. And part of the reason that I went undiagnosed for so long was because I was kind of a high flyer. So there was no academic reason to test me. But as I got into 7th and 8th grade year, I started to have more battles with anxiety and depression, and those underlying conditions were now becoming more overwhelming in my life. So I really started detaching from school, and there's a lot there. I mean, we could really probably do an entire podcast on my past, but I'll spare you a lot of those gory details. But there were a lot of things going on in my family life. There were a lot of things that were going on that pushed me away from school and away from education. And by the end of my 8th grade year, I was not allowed to graduate. I wasn't allowed to participate in graduation. My mom tried to put me in Catholic school so that the nuns could beat me back into shape. But I was, did not go so well. I was booted out of there before the end of Thanksgiving. I briefly had a stint at Monmouth Regional High School, where I teach at now, but that was a very tumultuous point in my life. So my mom had put me in this program where essentially they tried to set some guidelines for me. I often explain this as kind of like being on probation, in that we had a family counselor that set rules for us. And I very quickly violated those rules. And the terms of me violating those rules were that I was sent to live in a group home for a little while. And my dad won custody of me. I went to Bayonne. And by the time I got there, my life was kind of falling apart from the inside. So I often tell this story for young teachers, because I think it's important to understand that you probably wouldn't have expected that from the fact that I'm sitting here having this conversation with you today. And I really like to emphasize that there's no bad kids, right? Oftentimes we hear this, oh, this kid's a bad kid. And I'm sure that was said about me, and I've heard it said about other students. They're just kids who are going through bad experiences in their life. And that's what was happening for me during that period of time. When I went to college, I was going to be a computer science major. So at the end of my high school career did not go well. I was not allowed to graduate. I was caught my senior year forging doctor's notes, and they told me, it was this uncomfortable conversation because I was passing my classes, but I had missed almost 50 days of school in my senior year. So they decided no prom, no graduation, no senior trip, but you can have your diploma, and they sent me off on my way. And again, at that point, I was kind of content to never go back into education. And I'm kind of scared of who I might be right now if that had been the path that I had gone down. My father moved us out of Bayonne. So we were living up in Bayonne in Hudson County, and moved us down to Ocean County in New Jersey. And he incentivized me to go back to school. He was like, if you go to school, you can have free room and board in my house as long as you enroll in community college. So never being one to miss a free meal, there I go, into community college to be a computer science major and to become rich. That was going to be my dream. And some dreams you never come true, I guess, in that sense. But I'm happy now, which I think is worth more than that. But in Ocean County College, again, I was a computer science major, but for a kid with undiagnosed, untreated ADHD, sitting in a cubicle and staring at a computer screen all day. I think I was sharing with you my experiences at the DOE beforehand, not a great fit for me. So I was miserable, and I love to cook. So I thought I was going to go be a chef, that was going to be my dream out. It was probably more like the student loans that I owed than anything else that brought me back in September. And that was 2001. So unfortunately, 11 days into my sophomore year, everything changed. And having grown up in Hudson County, like right across the river from there, unfortunately, my stepmother's best friend, Colleen, was in the South Tower. And we knew she was in there. We were hopeful that, she had gotten out or was somewhere else, but it quickly became apparent within a couple of days that it wasn't. And I really, that really messed me up, was very traumatic for me, made me question a lot about what I was doing and what life was about and did I have a purpose? And I felt very strongly, although I had no answers to any of those questions, that I wanted to do something positive. I wanted to do something that was the opposite of September 11th. But I just had no idea what that was. And I was dating a girl named Christina, who is now my wife, and she was an education major, and she suggested, you would make a great teacher. And I kind of laughed her out of the room when she told me this. I was the kid who got kicked out of school. Now I'm going to go back and be a teacher. But she reminded me, I had an uncle who taught in Albany for over 30 years. And he used to tell us all the stories about, the kids that he knew and the things that he had done with them and where they were at now. And she reminded me of what my uncle had done. And she, said to me at that time when I was talking about how I had not connected with school, about how if I was in charge, I could do this entirely differently. I could make it whatever I wanted it to be. And that really interested me. It was what had I not connected with? What would I do differently if I were in the classroom? So that was kind of what drove me back in education. And I think, now, I'm a history teacher, but my focus is in Holocaust and genocide studies. And a lot of that also comes out of that experience around September 11th. Because for me, one of my driving sort of academic pursuits was trying to make sense of something that inherently didn't make sense to me, which was Colleen was one of the nicest people I've ever met in my entire life. How could you want to kill this person when you had never even met them? And that was something that drove me into some really difficult questions that eventually led me into genocide studies and the Holocaust and that sort of direction. So kind of a weird backstory to get into teaching. I wish it was just a little bit more generic, but it's made me who I am. So
no, I think it's better that it's not generic. It's more unique, and I'm sure that you're sort of seeing different challenges on your way to becoming an educator is something that many teachers face, or maybe people who don't even know that they want to be teachers are facing right now. But I'm curious, you mentioned that you were given this advice that if you were in control of the classroom, you would be able to make change. So what was something that stood out to you in your experiences in middle school and high school that you would want to change or you would want to improve that maybe you haven't?
Well, I felt there were some certain generic things about it that just kind of stood out to me. I always remembered elementary school as being very fun. I was excited to go there all the time, and then it kind of just stopped being fun, and it started being about rigor and testing and all these sort of things like that. And it's not that doesn't have a place in education, but to me, I really felt by the time that I was in high school that Joe Nappi was irrelevant to this conversation, that you could plug any person into that desk and it was exactly the same thing. And that was something that I really focused on when I went into education, was trying to build relationships with students. I wanted to understand who I was teaching before I decided how I was going to go about teaching those kids in the class. And honestly, that pursuit has taught me more, I think, than any professional development or even college classes that I took, because when you take that opportunity to see the world, and every year as a teacher, you're going to get hundreds of different kids with different perspectives on the world. If you give yourself the opportunity to kind of take a moment to look through their eyes, it's unbelievably enlightening to you and makes you think about things that I know for me, I had never stopped to think about.
Yeah. Speaking of coming from that student perspective, you mentioned before that you went for a while undiagnosed with ADHD, and that impacted your schooling experience. So how do you recommend pre-service educators or teachers address a student who they feel as if might deserve a diagnosis, but that's just not something that has come up in the conversation yet? So how should they sort of bring that into the conversation to best advocate for that student?
Right. I think it's really important for you to familiarize yourself in your district with what resources are available and who's there to help help you on that journey, because we wear a lot of different hats as teachers, but like none of us are, probably clinical psychologists who can diagnose this kid, but there is a school psychologist in the building who could help with that student. So I think like our role as educators is to kind of flag these kids that we see where we see issues that maybe could use some addressing, and to go out there and then to be familiar with those resources that are available in your district to get that kid connected there. And for me, a lot of that, I always try to develop some sort of relationship with the students' parents as well. And I think oftentimes that can be a very, interesting way of bridging that gap where, again, unfortunately, oftentimes if the kid is not academically, underperforming, there may be resistance to sometimes giving them services through the district. But I think, again, that's not something that you couldn't flag for the parents and say, maybe this is something worth looking at, or the school psychologist might have that conversation as well. But I think it's really important that, I just look at it this way. When you run into a student who's having some sort of a discipline issue, behavioral issue in your class, there's something driving that. Right. And it's sort of one of the things that I try to do as a teacher is try to understand what's going on here. And that's complicated. And sometimes it takes a really long time to develop that relationship and trust with those students. But I think if you do that, you're going to put yourself in a position to help that kid in a way that you wouldn't otherwise be able to understand.
So how do you usually go about building those relationships with students? Because of course, that's something so crucial, like you said, keeping a good relationship with parents and then also your students in your classroom. But what's a way that you do that in your classroom, maybe like in your teaching or at the beginning of class?
I should invite you. I'm doing a workshop on this at the Center for Future Educators and at Writer, so you got to pay for admission. No, I'm just kidding. Nice. Come take my workshop. It's called Let's Get It Started in Here, and it's all about the beginning of the school year and how you do that. Because again, like from day one, I'm trying to make my students have a fun and entertaining experience in my class while I am surreptitiously data gathering on them and like almost every single thing that we're doing in that thing. Because again, I feel like, one part of this is like building that classroom community, and the other part of it is me trying to understand who each of these individual kids are. So I have a lot of different activities that I run in the beginning of the year. I offer kids survey opportunities where they can answer questions, and I've spent a lot of time like refining that over the years to try to figure out like what questions can I ask this kid that's really going to give me the answers that I need to sort of understand their perspective on this. So it really starts from day one and then builds throughout the rest of the year. Because I really believe that if kids want to come to your class, like that is a huge step in you building a relationship with that kid. So they seem like two entirely disconnected ideas, but really I think they come together there. And I think also it's sort of you as a person too. I know like for you as early educators coming into this, kids will not connect with you if you're not your authentic self. And that's something that's very hard, especially for young teachers when you're coming into the classroom, is being comfortable being Bianca and being comfortable being Chelsea and not feeling like I have to button up my tie and be, Mr. Nappi at all moments of my life and do this. Because you can absolutely still have respect and, a healthy classroom climate without needing to sit in a dictator chair. You know what I mean? Like it's not necessary for that. But as a young educator, especially when you come out and I'm like 4 years removed from these high school seniors that I'm sitting across, that's a tough road to walk. And sometimes it's tough being comfortable in your own skin. So I think like that is also part of the process where like for young teachers, I think you really have to kind of find your voice and you have to find where you're comfortable in the classroom before you're going to expect to sort of have those great relationships. You know what I mean? And that's a tightrope to walk, I think, very early on.
We've actually spoken about that same concept on previous episodes, just about bringing your authentic, genuine self into the classroom, and the fact that students will realize if you're kind of putting on that fake persona and they want you for who you actually are. So that is definitely something that's very important, and we've spoken about it before. I want to go back to that idea of creating relationships with students at the beginning of the year. Something that I'm slightly concerned with going into the classroom is that a lot of times when educators speak with each other, they hear sort of like mixed stories and messages about certain students. And
Right.
so a question that I have for you is, how do you recommend educators sort of form their own opinions about students and remove themselves from the biases that they might take on from other educators from those conversations?
Well, I think, again, like a lot of it goes back to that like data gathering. And then the question is like, is this useful data? You know what I mean? Is the fact that a kid had a personality conflict with you helpful to me? I would say no, probably not. You know what I mean? Because I'm not you and you're not me. So all those things are kind of different. And for me, I always like to say, I mean, again, there's a big process. And I think this is another thing you have to think about is I experience this a lot with people who don't teach, where they're like, I don't know how you do this. How do you go into high school all the time? Like, don't they like eat you alive? It's like your perception of what high school was and what high school actually is. There's a large canyon between those two ideas in your brain. You know what I mean? So it takes some time, I think, for you to sort of recognize that, to understand that, you know, these kids are going to change multiple times their identity between freshman year and senior year. So even that kid who may have been a certain way sophomore year might walk back in junior wearing an entirely different hat and mask as they're trying on sort of those personalities. So to me, I find kind of limited value in that. Now, if you come to me and say, hey, this kid really had a hard time writing essays, okay, that's useful information. Like, that's good for me to know. Or like, this kid had really struggled with getting assignments in on time. That's useful information for me to know. This kid's a jerk. Like, I don't know what to do with that. You know what I mean? Like that's not useful to me. And I think it's important for students to kind of start the year. And I say this to them always in the beginning of the year, like, whoever you were last year, I've intentionally not asked anybody about that. So we're going to start fresh here. How we treat each other and how our relationship goes is all based on this. I'm going to treat you with respect every day. I expect you to come back to me with respect every day. I would advise you to get a picture of Aretha Franklin and hang it in your classroom. I do that all the time. I'm consistently going back to respect, right over there. Respect, respect, respect. For this.
Favorite song.
And go see, it's good, and it's iconic, and it's in their heads, and it's there for them to use all the time. But again, I think you showing them respect and treating them as individuals goes a long way. Because there's a lot of, I know, like for me, like I told you part of my story when I ended up in Monmouth Regional. By the time I went to Monmouth Regional, I was the kid who got kicked out of middle school. I was the kid who got kicked out of Red Bank Catholic. I was the kid who was the problem child. So when I got there, everyone expected me to play that role. And I was more than happy to play that role. Like, if that's what you expected from me, that's what I was going to give you, because you never gave me an opportunity to be anything different. And again, I think it's really hard sometimes, because some kids can really, get under your skin at different points in time. But you really, like, every day, to me, it's a challenge to be like, I'm going to greet you with a smile. I'm going to say hello to you. And we're going to start fresh every single day, because it's not productive for me to hold a grudge.
You mentioned how it's important to see students for not just how they're performing academically, but also for how they're coming into your classroom. And so I think a large part of that is their identities too. So I'm wondering, since you are a social studies teacher, I'm wondering how you are sort of able to bring students' identities into the classroom and present different things from a multicultural perspective, or just kind of teach history, but also represent your students in the curriculum.
Right. So two parts to that question. One part of that question is, again, kind of goes back to who am I teaching here? So who are these kids? And to me, there's always a question that I throw out in the survey that I find particularly interesting, which is, what have you learned about people like you in history? And I will never define what I mean by that. Kids will ask me, what does that mean? I'm like, it means whatever it means to you. I'm not going to answer that question. I don't want to give you that it's ethnicity or religion or gender or whatever you think it is. I'm interested if you've seen people in history that you feel reflect your experience. That's what I'm looking for. And a lot of times from that question, that kind of answers, I think, where you're going with this, which is what do I choose to hone in on within that class? Because I want kids to see themselves within the curriculum. That's very important. And I also want kids to see people who are not represented here in the curriculum. So to me, like who I choose to focus in or what direction I choose to go in is often going to be determined by that data that I gather in the beginning of the year. Because, you know, if I have 4 or 5 Filipino kids, and I'm in a U.S. history class, we're going to be talking a lot about, you know, Filipino immigration to the United States. And sometimes that means I'm going to be learning a lot about Filipino immigration to the United States because I wasn't prepared for that, you know, to go in there. So it becomes like a challenge that I take on and a way for them to see it within this. And I think more generically, like celebrating the things that bring us together and the things that make us unique. Like, I think that's really important. So I do this project in my class called like the Personal Heritage Project, where you can choose whatever you want to focus on to teach other people in the class about your own experience. So that could be a family history, or that could be a food that you particularly like, or it could be things like that. And we have sort of, you know, really great parent-teacher-student association. We've got other people in the district who are there. Like if a kid wants to do something food-related, but maybe doesn't have the money to do that, like we can connect them with some resources to do that and to bring it in. And it like gives everybody in the room a day that's kind of about them, where we're going to learn a little bit about their experience, and they're going to take over the class and they're going to do this. And some kids are really excited about it. Some kids are super nervous about it and don't want to do it. So, you know, I've put in options where like you could film it in advance, or you could do something like this and you don't have to be front and center and having a panic attack, you know, in order to present this information. But it gives us sort of a view into who you're sitting around and who these other people are that are around you. I mean, I teach in a wonderfully diverse district. So it's, for me in my career, one of the things that took me too long to recognize was that I was spending all this time like trying to figure out how to teach a world history class across the hallway from an ELL class that had 16 different nations sitting in that class over there. Like, that's not theoretical. I could have at any moment brought them across the hallway and, you know, invited them in. And it took me a really long time, I think, to recognize that, those resources that are around you. But there's some really, you know, fascinating opportunities for education right in front of you.
Absolutely. I admire your willingness to learn new information about cultures and histories that you haven't previously been exposed to make sure that students in your classroom feel as if they're represented in the curriculum.
That's honestly, that's like one of the best parts of the job. I know people brag about the summer, which is nice too, but honestly, it's getting to be a nerd for your entire life and continuously learn new stuff and like get paid to learn. Like, I don't know. I know I have the shaved head and the goatee, and I've coached football and stuff like that, but I'm still in a lot of ways still the 7th grade nerdy kid at the spelling bee who's like excited to fight, you know what I mean? Like, all those things are true. And again, I think for kids to see that, like, again, back to your authentic self, like, see all this, right? I can coach football and love Star Wars and be a giant dork and, you know, this thing like that.
I love Star Wars too.
You know what I'm saying? Like, they don't have to fit into one box. You could be many things, because we're all really many things.
I think it still makes like the curriculum and things we have to teach more interesting too, because it's never going to be the same. Like, just along, like with the students, it will never be the same. It makes it more interesting for you and for them.
And again, this might be where ADHD serves me, because I'm bored before they are. So that's usually helps me to try to keep things fresh. Right? I don't want to keep doing the same thing over and over. Really.
You mentioned the project ideas of students being able to bring in their own culture into the classroom, and that's actually one of the questions that we had, you know, how are students given the opportunity to bring their own history into the classroom? So why do you think it's important for a student to see themselves in the curriculum? I know we mentioned that we try to do it in certain ways. You talked about bringing in food that relates to their culture or exploring a part of their history, but why is that actually important for that student?
Well, for me, I kind of look at it as like, what is my role as an educator, right? I mean, this is one of the things when I talk about me getting a diploma, like I give a keynote at a lot of things. I was at an induction last night. And I talk a lot about like, what does it mean when you end your educational career? Like, what does it mean for me to get that high school diploma? And at the time, like, that just meant, well, I was above 70 and I had passed my proficiency test and I had a, you know, decent score on my SATs. So therefore you're ready for the world. And I just don't agree with that. You know what I mean? Like, I feel like we are trying to prepare students for success in like a diverse modern democracy. And that's a lot more complicated than just passing a science test, or, you know what I mean, having a good math score or doing something like that. So when you talk about like, why do students need to feel like they're present? Like, if I'm teaching a US history course, it's very important for me that these students feel like they're part of this history and that they have ownership of this country, because they do. Like, it concerns me that, you know, we're the country, you know, of the people, by the people, for the people. But if the people aren't engaged and don't feel like they can do anything with the system, where does that leave us? I mean, I could show you that part of history. It's not fun to look at. So for me, I feel like a very personal responsibility of showing students history that I wasn't taught. You know what I mean? Like, it's not like I walked out of high school fully understanding these things. I had all sorts of ignorant ideas in my head that, frankly, no high school graduate should have if we were educating them properly. And education, I mean, like, this is kind of the paradox of my story that I say all the time, is like, in some ways, I feel like education failed me. And in other ways, it was education that saved me. Right. And I think that's a really important thing to like reflect on as you go into this profession, is sort of like, why are you doing this? And also calm down and take a breath too, because like it's taken me 19 years to figure this out. And in a lot of ways, I feel like I'm still figuring this out. So I know I should sit here and be like, oh, well, I'm the state teacher of the year and I've got all the answers. Like, I still am working and I still feel like I've just gotten there. So, you know what I mean? It's a long time of commitment to the practice. So don't feel like pressure that like I got to walk in on day one and instantly be able to include every single. I couldn't, that's for sure. It took me a while to feel like I'm doing that. And I'm sure that, you know, there are certain areas that I could still improve on. But that's kind of like what this is, constant improvement, right? Commitment and constant improvement. Get a little better each year, learn something new each year, build a different relationship this year, and you just continue to become a better and better person. And that serves your students.
I am wondering, from all of those, you know, lesson planning that you have done and like ways to just like thinking about the history that you want to teach, what has been your favorite lesson that you've presented?
Ooh, my favorite lesson, that's a good one. There's a few. I mean, honestly, if it's not even history related.
Okay.
But well, I guess it is kind of history related, but it is like my favorite lesson involves me convincing students that the moon is a hoax. That's honestly my favorite lesson.
I want to sit in on that lesson.
Yeah. It's pretty good. So I come in, I usually wait for a spot in the curriculum where like we've just finished something. So like we just finished the Armenian genocide or something like that. And I'll be like, oh yeah, well, you know, we have some extra time. So, you know, I want to talk to you. I know this is going to sound wild when I say it to you. And like when I heard it the first time, I thought it was a joke. But, you know, I really seriously believe that the moon does not exist. And like then just going and it like opens up all these questions. But like sort of the background on this lesson is, you know, it's partially satire, but it's also like I have taken apart like the logical fallacies that you hear in a lot of conspiratorial thought. So what I'll do is play those roles for the kids so that they become infuriated because there's nothing. I just did this at Jose Marti STEM Academy. So these are like the top science students in the state. Like half the staff has doctoral degrees and they were like in the room with me. And none of them could win this argument with me about the moon not existing because I'm cheating. Like it's not a real fair logical argument I'm spinning around. But for kids, like I think it's really important for them to sort of be inoculated against this stuff, in that if you take it apart and look at what I'm doing, then it's not so mysterious. You know what I mean? It's like almost like a magic trick, like you're showing someone behind the curtain of like how this stuff gets done. Because again, one of the things that I'm kind of consumed with and obsessed with right now in education is just life in the digital world. Like the way you two grew up and the way I grew up were totally different. And you're just bombarded with all this information consistently. And like one of the key skills I think for your generation and for the generation coming up is, how do I pick apart what's true and what's false here? How do I know when I'm being misled? How do I know when I'm being intentionally misled right now? Because that is sort of the nature of the beast with social media, is, you know, whether that's for economic or political or whatever those reasons are, there's an active campaign to convince you of something, whether that's buying Skittles or endorsing a political candidate or whatever that thing is. But there's sort of, you know, I hate to ever quote Alex Jones for anything, but, you know, he said the quiet part out loud, which is, you know, there's a war on for your mind. And there is. And I think for me, that's one of those real interesting lessons that I think sticks with kids, where they get a chance to like see the way that you can be. One of the interesting parts of the lesson is that I never lie once. So there's no lies in this lesson. I give them a series of facts that are all cherry-picked, random tidbit things to make everything seem suspicious and sinister when it's not really there. So I mean, that lesson, I think above all else right now is my favorite, because it talks about 5 very common logical fallacies that you see a lot in conspiratorial thought. And it also, I think if I'm one thing, I'm a pretty charismatic speaker. So I also always end that with like, beware the charismatic speaker. You know what I mean? Of somebody who can convince you to something with this. And again, I think that to me is my favorite, not just because it's also super fun to do. I mean, if we're being honest about it, I mean, it's just fun fooling people and being that guy. I get to say things like the lunar industrial complex and bang on desks and scream at people. And it's a lot of fun. And I missed my calling to be a conspiracy theorist.
That's really interesting. I think that's a cool lesson to include. And you were mentioning helping students navigate digital spaces and how the way that we went through school is different from maybe how older generations have gone through school, in the sense that there's now all these digital tools and platforms that are infused into the school system as students move through the grades. So I'm actually taking a course all about that right now, digital literacies, and it's basically, you know, how we incorporate teaching students digital literacy in the classroom while also incorporating the regular content of the classroom. So how do you recommend, I know that lesson was a great idea into helping students recognize, you know, false information that they might find out there. So what other lessons or ideas do you recommend pre-service teachers use or other educators use to try to help build that lesson of digital literacies and navigating those platforms while also trying to navigate their content?
First of all, kudos to TCNJ for hooking you up with those skills. This is also another for like anybody who's not pre-service out there watching this. Like, this is a great reason why you want to take, you know, somebody on as a mentor or as a, you know, host teacher over there, so I can learn and steal all the cool stuff that you learned from TCNJ without paying tuition while I go over there and do this. So that's really cool. But I mean, in terms of this, I think it's giving them practical. So I focus mostly on media literacy, like outside of, I mean, because you know, information literacy is a big thing, and there's a lot of pieces of that are sort of already built into the curriculum. But I really like to focus in on media literacy in a lot of ways in doing this. And for me, it's all about giving students tools for how you can find information. And I think like very early on in my career, I was struggling with, like, I was teaching this world honors class, and I was totally unprepared to teach this class when I came in. I thought I was prepared, and then I read the curriculum, and I was really teaching Western Civ, like that's what this was. And I had no idea what I was doing, and I was like staying every day till like 6 o'clock at night, trying to read over the books and I felt like very important that I could like answer every question and knew exactly what happened. And one of the older members of the department said to me, you know, one day he was like, Joe, just go home, like stop this, like this is madness, you know, you can't know all the answers. He's like, the most important thing you can teach your kids is not that you have all the answers, it's where you're finding the answers and how you corroborate and find, you know, accurate information. And that kind of took a huge weight off my shoulders of feeling like I had to know everything walking into the class, and also sort of presented me with this framework that I still use later on, which is like, I have these kids for 180 days and that's it. So what do I want them to be able to do once I leave, like once I'm not there with them? And I think that's an interesting way to look at like the digital literacy space. Like, I want kids to know how to do a reverse Google image search. I want kids to be able to corroborate whether this has been, you know, thrown up there or covered by like any reliable source. I want students to understand that you're not going to know everything. And that sometimes is the most frustrating part of this. Is like, we've done a lot of this because unfortunately, like the war with Israel and Hamas, and teaching a Holocaust class on October 7th, like this instantly became front and center for us to talk about. And one of the things I had to get across to them is like, you're living through the fog of war. And anytime you're in a war, there are two sides that both have a active information arm that wants to convince you that they're correct. And for you, you're standing in the middle of this and you have to try to make sense of this. That's a really difficult spot to put a 14-year-old, 15-year-old, 16-year-old in there. They need skills for, how do I do this? Like, how do journalists do it? How do people do? So that's why I tend to focus on media literacy, because I want kids to sort of understand, if I was a journalist and I had a full background in trying to locate accurate information, how do you do that? And again, I think historical thinking skills also have a tremendous overlap with digital literacy skills, because historians have for thousands of years been trying to figure out who's telling the truth here, right, in these disparate sources and things like that. So I think really focusing on the skills is the most important part, I think, in terms of digital literacy.
Do students usually like come to you with different things that they will see on social media?
I love it, and that's what I want them to bring to me in class, so that we can go over it and talk about it. Because again, like, I'm going to talk about, well, how do I know where this is? And there's a variety of different tools, like geolocation is an interesting one, where you're seeing these images to be like, is this authentically where they say it is? Can I snag an image out of this picture and search online and see whether or not this has been uploaded before? Because there's a lot of things that are unfortunately very triggering and very emotionally responsive, but are also not actually true to what's happening here. You know what I mean? You might be getting recycled footage from 5 years ago that's presented as having happened yesterday. You might be getting something that happened in an entirely different context, presented in a separate context. Like, there's a lot of ways that you can be misled. And there's a lot of ways, unfortunately, that you can be misled without even being lied to, which is another really difficult sort of thing that we've gone over to. So like, one on that front, one of the things I tried to get across to them was like cherry picking. Like, I went through Hamas's charter and just pulled out like all of the things that sound positive in Hamas's charter, because they talk about, you know, like the family and sustainable incomes and all this. So if you take all that out and put it on one side of the paper, and then you go to the other side and you take out all this genocidal language and, you know, anti-Semitic language and put it on that side of the paper, and then I presented it to them as two separate movements. I'm like, so what do you think about this movement? And again, like, there's nothing factually wrong with either of those papers, but if I choose to only highlight one side of the story, you know, you walk away from that entirely misinformed of what this actual organization is. So, I mean, again, I think the real life, the practical ones are the most interesting to my kids, because again, if these skills are going to work, they have to work in real life. You know what I mean? It's no use for me to teach them these skills if I can't apply them in real time when they bring them in. But unfortunately, a lot of those answers are, we don't know. I love that we had the whole argument about, you know, that there was a particular missile attack when I was still in the classroom beforehand on a hospital in Israel, and there was like big back and forth about, you know, who did it, how did it happen. The New York Times, who I think journalistically has very high integrity, right? They certainly have a bias. Everybody has biases, and that's included, but their journalistic integrity, I think, is very high. They waited 2 weeks after this attack and then put out this like 4,000 word article on it that had video analysis, and, you know, here's where we have cell phone footage from, and we had one drone, and we have radio things, we have this. And after like 4,000 words of the most like detailed, sophisticated forensic analysis, the conclusion was, we don't know. Like, that's it. And that's a really unsatisfying answer sometimes, but a lot of times, if we're being honest, that's the answer. And, you know, it's important sometimes, I think, for students to wait until they have accurate information before they jump out and make conclusions like that. And that's a tough thing to do when everything's so immediately at your fingertips today.
Yeah.
But it's another tough one.
I feel like that's still important though for what we're like seeing in media and news now. Like, as you said, they're bringing examples that they're seeing like on Instagram, on TikTok, whatever social media they're consuming. So it's good that you're having those conversations in the classroom, because it's something that they're seeing right now, and they need to know how to handle it, or like how to interpret that.
And that's what I mean, because I mean, as cool as it would be for them to text me, you know, 2 years from now and be like, hey, Nappi, did you see this? Is this real? You know what I mean? Like, it's much better if they can walk out knowing what I would do. You know, how am I answering that question? And again, that's what Tom was trying to get across to me as an early teacher, was just show them what you do. You know what I mean? That's more valuable than you pretending that you're the omnipotent knower of everything that ever happened in Renaissance history. No.
I think that's an amazing piece of advice, especially for social studies teachers. The curriculum can be so expansive, and there's just so much that's there that you could learn, and you should know, you know, as much as you can, but it is good to know and to have that piece of advice that you're never going to know everything. And so giving your students the tools to be able to find it on their own if they ever needed to, that's really cool. Sort of related to that topic, I was wondering, especially as it relates to social studies, how do you sort of equip your students with the tools and experiences they need to become agents of change in their local community? Obviously, you talked about tying in current events to your curriculum, so how how do you kind of bring all of that together and empower them to be change makers?
Right. So I think it's really connecting them with avenues to make that change. Because I think part of teaching history, when you're doing it in a way that challenges students to think about justice and to think about, the rights and wrongs of the past, is that students are going to respond to that, and they're going to want to respond to that. The key thing about this is always giving them avenues to do it. It was always sort of dissatisfying to me, because it's always taught as like best practice in social studies that like, all right, we're going to talk about slavery, right? So if we're going to talk about slavery, then let's connect it to human trafficking, right? Because that way students see, here's what happened in the past, here's what happened in the future, and there's this connection here. And I would do that very early on in my career. And what my experience was that my kids would get all riled up about like, well, what do you mean there's slavery? And they're like, this is crazy. How could this be going on? How can we allow this to happen? And then I'd be like, all right, and now on to the next topic. You know what I mean? So it's like, I was getting reaction from these kids, but I just didn't understand how to channel it into some sort of positive thing. So what I've really started to work on later on in my career is showing students and being purposeful about this, about showing students people from history who were in extraordinarily difficult circumstances, who maybe didn't have everything going their way, but were able to make like tremendous change. Like we're sitting here during Women's History Month. So like Dolores Huerta is like somebody that you could look at here for doing this, who was like, unbelievable labor leader, involved and an intricate way in like developing all these things that are often credited to Cesar Chavez for good reason. And Cesar Chavez deserves credit in that, but she's also a huge part of this story. And both of them came from like sort of unbelievable circumstances. They had plenty of opportunities where it could have just been about them and they could have walked away from this movement, but instead they dedicated their entire lives to helping other people. And like kids really resonate with those stories and connect with those stories. And if you can sort of inspire them through those stories of like what's possible, and then introduce them to people who are actually doing the work right now. Because again, for any sort of cause that you're going to think of right now, there's some organization, there's some group that's out there actively trying to work on that project. And for me, it's been about, that sort of balance of my class time, right? So how much of my class time is worth a student being actively engaged in something that could literally change their entire outlook on life. So I'm maybe more willing than most to give up sort of that time. I mean, I don't want to say it's like entirely always like Google Genius Hour kind of model there, but like, in using some of my class time to allow them to work together to pursue these interests. And sometimes that happens collaboratively. Like we've had big groups of kids who will take on one issue together. I had 2 groups last year, one of whom was very interested in equity in terms of senior dues, which was something that I hadn't really stopped to think about. But like students who weren't able to afford to go to prom, weren't able to afford to go on the senior trip, weren't able to afford the tuxedos and the things that went along with that. So they got together and fundraised and came up with a pot of money and reached out to some of our cosmetology students to see if they would offer free hair and makeup and different stuff like that. They started to build connections out into the community with Lunch Break, a local shelter in our area who offers like tuxedo and free dresses and things like that. And they really built us. So by like the end of their senior year, by dedicating that time, they had sent 16 kids to prom and to senior events so that they could have the full senior experience, right? And I mean, like that was a considerable amount of class time that went into it. But when you see that result, I mean, I would say it's worth it, So I mean, it's a balance, and I definitely benefit from having the elective class, you know what I mean, and that extent of being able to dedicate it to it. But we've absolutely done class fundraisers with students in that, going all the way back to like my first year was during Hurricane Katrina, and we were talking a lot in class about like the racial and socioeconomic inequities of what was happening in Louisiana. And my kids were very passionate about like, let's do something about this, let's do something about this. So we got involved with Habitat for Humanity and started fundraising towards rebuilding some of the 9th Ward that was down there. So you could do it like collaboratively, where it's maybe doesn't eat up as much of your class time, but even like simple things about like introducing philanthropy in your classes, like do a canned food drive, you know what I mean? We do like UNICEF collections for like around Halloween and stuff like that in class. Like it doesn't eat up a tremendous amount of your time, and it sets an example to students that like, look at what we can do collectively in 5 minutes of our own time. You know what I mean? Like we donated 100 pounds of food to the food shelter. We donated $400 to UNICEF and both these many things. And like kids, like, you know, really feel, I mean, I believe for me that I found my purpose in helping other people. So however I can sort of trick you or cajole you into helping someone else, like I really believe like you're not going to go back after you do that. So that to me is sort of like, you know, central in my teaching is trying to do that. And then there's sort of like the elaborate versions of it and the simpler versions of it. But I always want to make sure that any group of kids that I have gets exposed to their own power and agency and, you know, how good it feels to just help somebody else out. But,
it seems like your classroom is that like space for change, even if it's like you said, a balance. You know, you are sort of trying to create that in your lesson planning, make sure you have all the elements that you need, but you're still helping students see their place in the world and how they can make change. I feel like when you do things like that, once they see connected to an issue, like, oh, we gotta rally around this, then they feel more tied to it, and it's not something like, oh, well, we're gonna fundraise for this issue. Like, I feel like growing up in high school was always like, oh, we're fundraising for this club to like give our profits to a certain organization. But it was just something that was a tradition that we do each year that we kind of lose the momentum of, and we don't remember why we're doing that. So I like that stuck out to me that you said that, you know, your students get rallied up about something.
Also, like noticing in what you're saying too is that also like this is kind of handed to you, right? Like you didn't pick this fundraiser. Somebody else decided that this was the important fundraiser. And like I understand that sometimes as like an intro to it, but like I think ultimately what you want to get to is like kids having ownership over this. And it may not come from every single kid in the class, because let's be honest, like if I have 150 kids, like not all 150 of them are going to feel very passionately about one particular subject, you know what I mean, at 16. But there's probably 5 or 6 kids that do. And for them to speak on that issue or to say something about that issue can really be enlightening to their peers. More so, like it's one thing for me to stand up here and make that suggestion, but like it really, if it comes from them, that's where like that long-term growth sort of comes out of, is like them feeling ownership in it. Because at the end of the day, it's not about like what I think are the most pressing issues in the world, because I could certainly lay out the Nappi list of what I see in the world that's out there, but it's like, what do my students see? Because that's what's going to get them engaged. You know what I mean? It's not me deciding like, hey, listen, we need to end homelessness right now. I mean, like, as noble as that is, if they don't feel ownership of that, you know, they're not going to walk away with the same connection.
Right. I think that piece of students feeling connected to the cause is really important. In my senior year of high school, I had the opportunity to organize a color run for the autism program in my school, and we worked alongside POAC, which is a New Jersey-based organization that provides resources and services and information to families who have kids with autism. And so that experience of creating that event for pretty much the second half of the year was probably the best experience for high school for me. And that's where I learned the most about communicating with outside companies, communicating with administrative people in the school, organizing, you know, people my age to be volunteers. And it was absolutely the most rewarding thing. And it's funny that it wasn't even necessarily academic related. It was more so extracurricular related, but it was something that I felt passionately about. And I think the experiences that I had from it and the skills I developed really helped me in college, and, you know, gain leadership roles in college to plan events in college, and it sort of all went hand in hand. So I think that piece of students being able to choose what they want to do and pick something that they're passionate about is really important.
Right. It's democracy, right? I mean, like, that's what we're supposed to be doing here, right? You get them owning this process.
Yeah, student-led initiatives are the best. Like, that's, I feel like, a place where students thrive. So I think it's up to teachers to realize that they need more student-led things.
Yeah, and I don't know. I hear it so often where it's like, oh, these kids don't care, or they're distracted, or they're like this. But I think a lot of times they're just, the kids themselves feel powerless. Because I know, like, I remember my own experience. Like, you're watching these horrors unfold in front of you, and it's like, what can I do for this? Like, that's the way I felt after September 11th. Like, I was just watching this horrific tragedy unfold. Like, what is my role in this? What can I do? And it wasn't until I decided to actually get involved and try to do something that then I realized, like, it doesn't have to be that way. You know what I mean? Like, you do have the ability to make some positive change here and have an impact and do the things that you're doing. And it doesn't have to be, you know, I always tell kids, you know, just because you can't solve every problem doesn't mean you can't solve any problem. right? And like that's an important step towards progress, because if each one of us, I met one of the joys of my career is getting to meet with all these like Holocaust survivors who have just like such an unbelievable view of the world from their own experience. And like one, Manny Lindenbaum, who lives over there, like his whole sort of concept is that if you're just focusing on what am I doing to help others, like if everybody had that mentality of like trying to help somebody else, then like the net result of everybody just kind of dealing with the problems right in front of them would be like world changing, you know what I mean? And it's like, again, I think we put a lot of pressure on ourselves of like, I need to solve every problem that's out there. Like, no, you don't. Just fix what's around you. Be a problem solver. I think ultimately that's what teachers are really great at, is problem solving, right? You're going to find this out very quickly, right? You are going to solve more problems in a single day than some careers will solve in maybe their entire time that they're running it. Like, it's just bing, bang, boom. And you know, think about it from the perspective of your students and give them that same power. And I think that that's really, you know, an empowering moment for you and your students.
I appreciate the point you made about power structures in the classroom. And I think a lot of times teachers sort of create the image that they are the most powerful person in the room and they're the all-knowing and students should just follow what they say, but that's not necessarily the case. So how do you in your classroom give students power and initiative to decide what they're learning, what they're doing? Maybe they have choice over assessment types. What does that sort of look like in your room?
Right. So I want them to be able to say things to me too. Like, I think that's really important. Because again, like what you were describing, like you just think about how unhealthy that is for a kid to walk out into the world and believe that one person knows everything. Like, that is a wild thing to leave a kid with, that impression, to go out there in the world. Because again, it's sort of that unfortunate thing. If they believe that about you, then they'll believe that about somebody else. And like, you know, maybe somebody else doesn't have the intention of teaching them math in 7th grade. You know what I mean? Like, that's a really scary viewpoint to leave kids with. So I would definitely caution you away from that. And again, I think part of that is being comfortable in yourself and understanding that like you can have structure in your room. You can have expectations in your room for your students. You cannot tolerate unsafe behaviors or, you know, disrespectful behaviors in your room and not have to raise your voice. Like, I think I could count on one hand the amount of times in my career that I've actually had to like yell at students in a classroom. And that was all because there was like an imminent safety, you know, something where somebody was going to get hurt, right, where that actually came up in the class. So again, it does kind of go back to building those relationships when you talk about this. And it talks about, you know, again, giving your students avenues for feedback is really important to me too. I mean, this is something where like, you know, not to fully endorse Google Classroom, but like Google Classroom gives me a great opportunity for me to data gather and have conversations with kids that they might be uncomfortable having. Because there are oftentimes like situations that go on in your class where this kid does not feel comfortable raising their hand or coming to you about it. But you have to build in avenues for those kids to connect with you and like to be able to share that like, hey, I'm in the back of the room and I'm really uncomfortable next to this student because some, you know, X, Y, and Z happened. Where it's like, it takes 3 seconds for me to move that kid's seat and now everybody's comfortable in the room and we can get back to, you know, having a productive conversation. So I think avenues for that are really good. And again, I think student choice to me is paramount. Like, I always want them to have opportunities in what they're doing. I mean, I'm a big UBD guy. I'm a like, let's start at the end and figure out how we're going to get back from there. And again, there's a lot of different ways to get to the end. It doesn't always have to be, you know, multiple choice tests, you know what I mean, to get to that end. So I think giving them opportunities that speak to their strengths, that do that to them, are really interesting. I mean, because you have kids, like I've had kids in the past who've done me, like they'll pitch to me, you know, well, instead of doing that project, what if I did an entire animation on this? And I'm like, do it, just go. Or I want to see what this will look, you know what I mean? Like, there's that fun of experimentation in your class where you're like, all right, if this kid's going to demonstrate to me that they understand this concept and that they've met the standard, I get a cool animation out of the deal too. You know what I mean? It's not all bad. I mean, I think like flexibility in that is really important. So I always try to build in some student choice, especially on assessments. And when we do projects, I try to let them work together in the class, picking groups for them and sometimes letting them pick groups for themselves at some point in time. And again, sort of having that connection there.
Do you believe that, like, when you say assessments, what does an assessment look like in your classroom? Like, do you believe in like formal assessments?
I am a huge, I don't want to say opponent. Opponent's too harsh of a word here, but I do not love multiple choice tests. I don't love the idea that there's only one answer to a historical question. Like, that bothers me in a lot of ways sometimes. And it's not to say that there's not facts. There are definitely facts, but I'm never asking facts on a test. You know what I mean? I'm asking students to apply facts to demonstrate to me their knowledge. So to me, like, I've tried to move away as much as possible from like multiple choice testing and more into seminars and sort of opportunities for kids to talk about this, project-based learning for them to do this, written, when we're doing something like that. Like, I want to see if they can actually compose a thought and put this together in writing around that. So whether that's short answer, open-ended question, document-based question, you know what I mean? Things like that connect them back to that subject matter. Now, the downside to that is, of course, it's way faster to grade the Google form with all those things than it is to actually sit here and read those kids' writing. But to me, it's in that process of reading their writing where I get to develop that relationship with you. You know what I mean? Because I know, like, a lot of teachers very much freak out about AI and like, oh, this kid's gonna make the AI is writing all the papers for this. But like, if you started on day one reading some of their responses, and especially for me, like, I always have them sort of write them out on these survey things. Like, it becomes quickly apparent when someone is using AI. I've yet to find a kid using AI that's managed to mask their own voice very well in the AI, where it's not like, super apparent. But again, for assessment, when you talk about that in class, it's going to look very differently depending on what we're doing and sort of what fits well with this. If we're doing a whole lesson on Andrew Jackson, the Trail of Tears, that might end with a mock trial, where that looks like these kids applying that into this. If we're doing, a unit on the Holocaust and survivors, that might end with us watching a movie and then them filling out some ethics questions and now us having a debate about the ethics of this. But it's going to be something that's going to force them to understand the material enough to participate in whatever that action is. You know what I mean? So that's always the way that I'm dealing with it. And again, probably going back to the fact that I'm the first one board in the room, like, it's going to look different. I'm going to experiment with a lot of different things.
I find what you said so important, though, because I feel like you said, multiple choice, okay, that's easier to grade. But I think teachers have a social responsibility where, even though something may take less time, it's like, how are students going to walk away? Like, what takeaways are they taking from your lesson and then bringing that out into the world? So I think thinking through that is really important.
Yeah, start at the end and work back through that. Try to figure that out from where you want them to be, and then how do I get them there? Like, that to me is the central task when you're starting something up.
Okay.
To expand on like the different assessment types that you were talking about, I know for me in college, one thing I noticed was that there's so many discussions in college in different classes, and in high school I never really had the opportunity to have those conversations. It was more so just sit at the desk, take notes based off the PowerPoint, and there's no opportunity for student voice. So in my future classroom, I hope to have, debates like you were saying, maybe simulate like a mock trial type of thing, have classroom discussions. But one concern of mine is, how do you get students to participate who are typically a little shy and don't like to contribute to those larger class discussions?
Right, so I think it depends on what the particular thing is that you're doing, but there are definitely students who don't want to participate. When we do a seminar and you go around the room and somebody, like, everybody has to speak in those spots. Like, I get a lot of students who are very uncomfortable in the spotlight and doing that. Now, for me, I feel like it's important for you to be able to communicate verbally with somebody else. So that's something that I work on with them individually, where I want to sort of scaffold them up to being comfortable in that position. And sometimes that's a process and sometimes it's not. And again, a lot of that oftentimes shows up as like me having an individual conversation with the student about like what is going on. Because I have had students in the past, especially when I was early on, where we'd get to a moment where like they're supposed to present a project and they'll literally cut class. Like, they're that terrified that they won't show up to class. So you never want to put a kid in a position where they're like being traumatized by like something that you're doing in the classroom, you know what I mean? But you do want to kind of work with them to build up the confidence. So it might mean that I'm going to take some time out after school and me and you are going to have a conversation together in this closed environment where I'm going to be very cognizant of trying to build you up. and talk about how great that answer was and how, how this would have played off of somebody else's answer, or, something like that, to try to help them develop confidence to do it. And also, again, like back to what we were talking about in referrals beforehand, like if a student is really suffering from that level of social anxiety, are they talking to somebody about that? Are you working through that? Are you doing that? You know what I mean? Because I could easily just say to the kid, hey, write it down on a piece of paper and take that from this. But I'm kind of leaving this overarching problem for them, out there untreated or undiscussed. So, it's just something to kind of think about as you go into that is, I always offer them the opportunity, like if you're uncomfortable presenting it that way, please reach out to me and let's have a conversation about that. So whether that's through the Google Classroom or whether it's through email or in some other way to do that, that's true. Journaling is also another good way for you to get information back from your students in a coherent and private manner where they can write to you in the journal. And then I'll often tell kids, like when they put journals back, if they want me to read it, that they can leave a sticky note or something sticking out of the top, and when I go back, then you can easily see that that's there. And again, I think that's kind of like an outdated model now with like Google Classroom and stuff like that, but leaving those opportunities for that communication, I think are really important.
That's awesome. Thank you.
Virtual journals now, maybe.
You see that? I gotta get. This is why I need to mentor you about it. Then you can teach me all these new fancy tricks.
One of my professors does that. Instead of like written journals, we will use Canvas or Google Classroom, and it'll just be on a Google Doc instead of.
Oh, okay. So that's I can handle that. All right. Yeah. If it's Canva, all right, I can handle that too. That works.
Yeah, not as fun as like pen and paper, I suppose, and like taking the journal off the shelf. But I guess going into your Google Drive can be kind of fun too. Yeah. Shifting gears a little bit, I'm wondering what has been like some of the most challenging moments for you while teaching. Like, is there one moment that you can think of, or maybe even broader, just something that you have found challenging? And what's some advice that you have to overcome those moments?
Okay, so this really speaks to like a wider conversation on like difficult conversations in the classroom. Which again, like I would urge every pre-service teacher out there, every person who's going in the profession, to take some kind of professional development around handling difficult conversations in the classroom. Because one thing that's sort of central to this, and I really love Facing History and Ourselves, like I'd endorse them as a really great model here, but there are many good models that are out there that you could take a look at. But Facing History and Ourselves model, just like really all of their models, starts with you. And like for me, like I talked to you before about September 11th, and 20 some odd years on now, I have no problem having that conversation. But it was very difficult for me to teach about September 11th when this was very still close to me and dealing with that. And I just kind of like tough it up now, like, and pushed myself into that and really caused myself a lot of discomfort in those lessons with those students. And like, I'm lucky that I never really got into any sort of a conflict or like a tough moment with a student while I was doing that. But I kind of like look back on it now of like, what would have happened if I was challenged in that situation? Because I was not emotionally prepared to have that conversation. And I think that's something that I've gotten better at now in my career, is like when I walk in, and especially like sometimes after school shootings or things like that have happened where like kids want to talk about it, where I have to be honest with the kids and just say like, guys, listen, we're gonna get there, but like I just can't today. Like I just cannot do this. So why don't we take 5 minutes and let's journal about it and jot down your thoughts and write those out. And I just need some time to process before we go into it. Because I think, again, whenever you're dealing with these difficult conversations, you have to first know where you're at and that you're comfortable having those conversations. So I think that's one thing that's really important when you're talking about dealing with that, is understanding that it's okay to not be okay. And it's okay to express that to your students. Because again, part of that being your authentic self, like, listen, guys, I'm not ready to have this conversation today. And that's okay. And if you're not ready to have it tomorrow, that's okay. Like, you don't have to feel like you need to put yourself in a emotionally fragile state on behalf of, trying to advance this conversation. And also, again, like, I think for teaching, like, you're trying to teach a kid how to think. You're not trying to teach a kid what to think. And if you're too personally connected to this subject matter, you're probably not aware of your own biases in going into that subject. And that's another really dangerous thing, to walk into the classroom where you're like discovering how you feel about something in real time with kids. Like, you really need to think that out, and you really need to understand where you're at, so that I'm not presenting my side of the story to these kids. I'm presenting an objective look at the story and allowing them space to make decisions. So that I think is one of the more challenging parts about this, and something that I'm still trying to work on myself as I go through. But I think it has broader resonance outside of just that conversation, though. There's educational philosophers kind of fallen out of favor nowadays, but his name is Chaim Gunnell. You ever heard of this? That's why I would give you $5 for him if you had heard of it. Most people have never heard of him. But he has like a really excellent quote where he talks about how he's come to this uncomfortable conclusion that he controls the weather in this classroom, and that it's his very mood that sets the climate, and that it's his response at any moment that can choose to humanize or dehumanize one of his students, to escalate or de-escalate a situation. And again, I think sort of that to me really resonates, because I think if there's one thing that's true about teaching, it's that you absolutely set the weather. If you walk in a bad mood, and the kids are going to feel that because they're connected to you in the room. So that is a lot. It's an interesting thing to reflect on, because I think, again, you have to kind of put yourself first. And this is a profession that is all about putting somebody else first, right? Like, that's what we do. So one thing that's been really hard for me to come to terms with in my career is that maybe I got to do something for myself right now, and just step away from this and take care of me, so I can walk back in on Tuesday and be the sunshine that my children need, in their lives when they come into this. Like, that's a tough thing to kind of to wrap your mind around and to think about. But it's something that I hope I'm getting better as my career goes on.
I think that's such a great piece of advice, though, because I feel like sometimes you try to get so much packed into a lesson. It's like go, go, go all the time. But like you said, it's okay to say, hey, I just need a break. Well, let's do this right now.
And your kids need a break too. Now it's SEL, right? You got your social emotional learning. We're going to have a nice SEL break. We're building brain breaks in. We've got some time for them to relax and get to talk to each other and do that. Because it's, again, it is a weird time that we live in now, where it's like school is one of the few spaces where kids are like required to be off their phone and like communicating in a sort of group setting. Like, it just isn't happening in a lot of places anymore. So, you got to build some time for that too, I think, in there.
We've talked a lot in past episodes about taking care of yourself as an educator and sharing self-care practices with your students. And so I think that's a really important message, that there's so much that goes on in the world in current events. And especially as a social studies teacher, students might want to come in the next day and talk about it. But if you're not ready to have that conversation, you shouldn't. And it doesn't mean that it won't happen ever. It just means that you might need a few days to process, think about what that discussion might look like, and then take that on with your students. So that is really important. Just to kind of speak to like connecting with your students a little bit more as our sort of wrap-up question for today, we wanted to ask what lessons you have learned from your students, because you mentioned before that being an educator is sort of a lifelong journey of learning, and so you're teaching yourself. We talked about like new historical cultures and backgrounds that you've educated yourself on, but obviously students bring so much into the classroom themselves. So what have you learned from them in your career?
Again, we could take another 3 hours on this one in between this stuff. So it's like, it's different every single year. Like, something sticks out to me. There's like one interesting story from last year that really still resonates with me. Like, I had a student who did a project. Well, their personal heritage project was about their family and growing up in our town. And he had a very familiar last name. I've had many students who had that same last name. I know that they were the big family in the community. And part of his project was about how he was part Cherokee Native American and who had immigrated here from Georgia right around the same time as the Trail of Tears. And I was like really fascinated by that fact, because I was like, really, you're Cherokee in New Jersey? Like, I've always associated that with like the southern part of the United States. I never really understood the history behind that. And you just from that little tidbit in his class sent me down this rabbit hole of trying to dig out the history behind the BIPOC community in our town. And it's really led to this very interesting history project, and I'm trying to, if this was more of a sabbatical and less of me traveling around other places, this is what I would be working on. But I'm trying to build out the curriculum around US 1, really around the town of Tinton Falls, which has this history that I would have never stumbled upon if I hadn't had that conversation with that kid and I hadn't heard their story in class. Like if I didn't give my microphone to him and let him tell this story, I would have missed all of this incredible learning opportunities for future students that were right in front of my face. And that's just like one of many. Like you were talking about your work with like autism. So we have some students this year who are, on the ASD, and their project, one of the things they're working on for Be the Change is to go out and just talk to teachers about their experience, because all of them are non-classified, but are on the spectrum. And like, what is their experience like in the classroom? Because and again, this is something that they generated where they felt like teachers just didn't understand their experience and what was happening out there. So again, like every year, there's another story like that just like totally flips the way that I understand my community, I understand my students, I understand the way that they go out there. So like any chance that you can give yourself to do that, like take it. You never know what you're going to learn and the way that somebody is going to change your perspective on the world. I do this kind of like hokey thing in the beginning of my year where I talk about like historical perspective, where I hold a book out and like one side of it is orange and one side of it is blue and this side of it is red and this side of it is white, and we just like, what do you see? And it's like we could sit here and just yell at each other all day long, that like that's yellow and that's red and this is blue or whatever it is, or we can try to take ourselves out of our comfort zone and see the world through somebody else's eyes and realize that this book is in fact all of these things from different angles. And the only way that we can truly understand what we're looking at is if we're willing to take on that slightly uncomfortable experience of stepping outside your shoes and seeing the world through someone else's eyes. And I think that, like when you talk about listening to your students, like that's what it does for you. That's that opportunity that's there, because really like just spending even a couple minutes just considering like what would this lesson be like if I was the student in class is really one of the best pieces of feedback you can give yourself.
I think you are a storyteller, like through the way that you teach, but I think you're definitely showing us that your students are bringing their own stories too, 100%. Which is really, really like amazing that you're given the space to do that.
Yeah, and definitely. Can I leave you one other piece of pre-service advice for you when you come on? You gotta build some time into your schedule for you every single day. You have to do something self-care for yourself, whether that is exercise or I'm a big weird night walker, so I like to go out and just wander at night. And like, again, I unplug, I don't do anything. I just give myself some time to process, like 20, 30 minutes. Sometimes my daughter will come with me and ruin my processing. But most of the time, we'll go out there and just walk around. But like taking that time for yourself every day, because again, especially in the first few years, it's very stressful when you're doing everything. Like that's part of the job. And eventually it gets easier and easier and easier. Every year becomes a little bit easier and a little bit easier and a little bit easier. But from Jump Street, start with that self-care for yourself. Make sure that you're taking care of yourself that day and make sure you're prioritizing that. Because again, we go back to that setting the weather in the class, like it's really important for you to take care of yourself so that you could be there for your students. So I know it seems contradictory in this profession to put yourself first, but put yourself first at least for a half hour a day or something like that to get yourself situated.
I think it'd be especially important to do that like from the beginning, like from day one. Even I know like a lot of teachers going into the profession are sort of trying to manage all this stress of like their first year of teaching, and so starting those routines from the beginning is something that we've talked about in previous episodes, and making sure that it's something you do on a daily basis, like you said. So that's a great piece of advice that you have left us with.
Nice.
Well, amazing. Thank you so This was so valuable. Like for me, I'm history secondary ed. That's my major. So a lot of what you said is really important to me.
High five for that. Thank you. Good job over there. That's good.
And I'm sure so much of it, can be pulled into any content area. It's all valuable information.
I'm math, and I still think about the ways that history.
That's right. You still have a high five for that. That's it.
No, but everything that you were saying about, bringing students' identities, and I think that there's so much like place for intersectional content areas. So I'm personally interested in like history and math, and showing students that math is not just numbers, but everything that you said is so insightful. And I'm like beyond glad that we got to talk to you, and I could probably keep talking to you for like 4 more hours from now.
Well, you got more podcast episodes. You can invite me back at some point in time.
You'll have to come back.
That sounds good. Sounds good to me. All right.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. I appreciate you listening. Please look out for more of these longer length episodes where we're going to have a guest who comes on that speaks about their personal experiences, and look out for our Motivational Monday episodes, which is just shorter episodes with Bianca and I talking about ways that you can take care of yourself, ways that you can motivate yourself for the week, and we'll be setting you up for a great week.
That's right. Thank you. Thank you for joining us, and happy Thursday, everyone. We're sending you to the world with good vibes.